Hello, my name is Jean-Jacques Nantel. If catastrophes are catastrophes, it's because they release an enormous amount of energy so quickly that human beings have no time to react or to protect themselves. Curiously enough, most catastrophes are the result of a very slow and perfectly obvious accumulation of energy that everybody sees without doing anything to stop it. At the beginning of the 21st century, many such catastrophes are in the making. We still don't have a world government to protect us from international traffickers, terrorists, or mass polluters. The stockpiling of atomic bombs continues. Billions of tons of deadly chemical products are poisoning our natural environments, etc., etc. In nature, when a species destroys its environment, its population collapses. It's a rule. There are many clear examples of that in the far north, where very few species live. For instance, lemmings multiply so fast that they often die en masse of starvation. Usually, their population collapse is followed a little later by the population collapse of their predators. Another example of that natural phenomenon has been given by the caribou herd of the pristine environment of River George in northern Quebec. That caribou herd, which numbered 800,000 individuals in the 1990s, fell to 15,000 in 2014. They didn't disappear, but their population collapsed. Despite all their intelligence and ingenuity, human beings will inevitably suffer the same fate in the future, since they keep increasing at an exponential rate their consumption of everything on a planet which doesn't grow in size. Nowadays, even educated people keep repeating that every single human being has the inalienable right to reach the American standard of living. In other words, each of them should have a car and the chance to spend his vacation on a tropical island. It's true, it is their birthright, as it is their inalienable right to live 10,000 years or to spend their vacations on Pluto. But the question is it possible? As I said in the first video of this series, our dying planet, which was already sick in the 1970s, had to support 40 China of 1980 in 2015, and will have to support 80 China of 1980 20 years from now. All that while the rest of our former third world tries to copy the Chinese success. Obviously, it's impossible. If the Americans were able to live the American dreams for centuries, it was essentially because they had at their disposal a whole new continent to consume, the Americas. If the landscapes around the Mediterranean Sea are often treeless or semi-arid, it is of course due to the climate, but it is also due to the fact that for thousands of years humans have destroyed the natural environments of the region. 4,000 years ago, pharaohs were hunting large animals like hippos and crocodiles near Cairo. 3,000 years ago, there were cedar forests in Lebanon and wild lions in Greece. And in Julius Caesar's time, there were still wild native elephants in Algeria and the environment to support them. All that was totally gone at the end of the Middle Ages. Even Northern Europe was then so thoroughly deforested that in some countries peasants were not allowed to hunt in forests. It is the discovery of the Americas which took Europeans out of poverty. All of a sudden, they found themselves in the possession of an empty continent which was more than 4 times the size of their own. By exploiting the gold, the furs, and all the other resources of the Americas, Europeans could finance the development of the technology that would allow them to conquer the rest of the world. In reality, the Americas were not empty when Columbus landed in the Bahamas. They were even densely populated in countries like Mexico or Peru. But something totally unexpected happened after the landing of Columbus. European diseases, which were not lethal for Europeans, spread on the continent where maybe 90% of the native population disappeared. In many regions, American Indians died centuries before the coming of the very first white explorer. It was as if the whole continent had been struck by a gigantic neutron bomb. The roads, the cities, the buildings, the bridges were still standing, but the native population had almost disappeared. The catastrophe had been so sudden and powerful that modern archaeologists keep finding traces of ancient, densely populated settlements all over the Americas, even in the Amazonian jungle. Very few people realize that this demographic collapse had a tremendous positive effect on the natural environments of the continent. Left alone for the following centuries, forests grew and thousands of wild species of plants and animals proliferated. The rebirth of the natural environments of the Americas was one of the main reasons why European settlers and their European mother countries could become so rich for so long. There were other factors at play. For example, the fact that at the very moment Native Americans were disappearing, Europe experienced a population explosion due to the introduction of the very nourishing plants developed by Native Americans. Plants like corn, potato, tomato, cacao, cassava, etc., etc. Another factor which made Europeans rich, at least in what was to become Latin America, was the fact that they had conquered highly centralized empires in Mexico and Peru. That conquest, from coast to coast, so to speak, allowed them to replace the local aristocracy and to enslave the rest of the population who was forced to work in mines or on plantations. In the Caribbean region, plantations were so profitable that the Spaniards quickly replaced the dying native population by black slaves they bought in Africa from Arab and African slave traders. That brutal exploitation of the Americas made Spain so rich that for centuries countries like France, England, or the Netherlands fought many wars to conquer some of the sugar-producing islands in the Caribbean. In North America, the situation was quite different because there were no organized empires to conquer. Unable to enslave the born guerrilleros who lived in the dense forests which covered the Atlantic coast, Europeans waited more than a century before founding their first colonies in North America. Rather than relying on slave labor, the first settlers had to do all the work by themselves, including farming. This is when started the American dream, which has always been based on hard work. By chance, North America was the largest, the emptiest, and the least developed of the three Americas. It was also the closest to Europe, and its climates were quite similar. As a result, it was to become the preferred destination of the millions of poor Europeans who wanted to flee the wars and the oppression in the Old World for the following 4 centuries. North America was so rich and underexploited that from 1615 approximately, there hasn't been a year without an increase in its European population. It all started in Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. After some difficult years, the colony grew rapidly to reach 6,000 inhabitants in 1630. 20 years later, in 1650, they were 52,000. After 1650, as you can see, the population of the future United States was to double in size every 20 years until 1850 approximately. If a mathematician of 1850 had tried to predict the future evolution of the United States population, he would probably have drawn a straight line along the curve showing their population growth between 1607 and 1850. For 1870, for example, which means 20 years later, he would have predicted 46 million people, when the real number would be 39 million. For 1910, he would have predicted something like 184 million rather than 92. And for 2010, he would have predicted about 6 billion inhabitants rather than 309 million. Why did the American population stop growing at the same pace after 1850? For a very simple reason, because it had reached physical limits. If, before 1850, the Americans could double their population every 20 years, it was because the territory they occupied was growing at a similar rate. The territory of the 13 colonies of 1776 more than doubled in 1783 after their War of Independence. It doubled again 20 years later in 1803, and it doubled again around the year 1850. It is only when the tidal wave of American and European migrants hit a physical barrier, the Pacific coast, that the American population growth started to decline. This is when life started to become more difficult in North America. From then onwards, the environmental constraints would force the population to slowly reduce its growth rate. Before 1850, migrants could always go further west if they wanted to enrich themselves without interfering with other people's interests. There were always new places where to hunt, fish or farm, new mountain forests to cut, or new mineral deposits to discover. The gold rush of 1849 in California has been one of the last examples of that anarchic economic growth, an anarchy which created the turbulent Californian society we all know, that unstable, free, and decadent society of innovators which would deeply influence the world culture. Hollywood, Disneyland, Silicon Valley, the sexual revolution, the flower power, and even Las Vegas have been the product of the Californian culture. However, after 1850, that free-for-all was no longer possible. The population was growing so fast that people had to stop wasting resources and start using the land in an ever more efficient manner. Even if the conquest of the West was an east-west migration, the economy started growing more rapidly in a north-south direction because it was more profitable to follow the natural north-south orientation of the continental geography. At a smaller scale, farmers learned to farm by following the natural contour lines of their fields in order to reduce the land erosion. By becoming more rational, the U.S. economy provoked the disappearance of the more primitive and less profitable lifestyles. Trappers and the wild animals they preyed upon all but disappeared. The great migrating bison herds were replaced by cattle. And when settlers started using barbed wire to protect their farms, their water sources, and their crops, it triggered a barbed wire war between them and the cattle herders who wanted to keep moving freely through the prairies from one waterhole to another. In the process, the Plains Indians, who had grown accustomed to the presence of white men on the continent for more than 3 centuries, were taken by surprise when, in a few short years, the exponential growth of the white settler population destroyed their way of life and forced them into reservations. Within decades, the families of the first settlers would themselves be replaced by industrial companies who would take advantage of every economic crisis to buy the land of the least efficient farmers, which forced them to migrate en masse in the boom towns speculators were building along the railroads. Since children are rarely profitable in cities, the national birth rate kept falling. That reduction in the population growth would be accelerated during the Civil War of 1861-1865, when at least 600,000 young Americans died. By destroying the agrarian and slave-based civilization of the Old South, the Civil War hastens the industrialization and the urbanization of the United States. It is not a coincidence if the rest of the world noticed the emergence of a new world power in North America around 1850, exactly when its population growth rate started to diminish, since it was the moment when the local environmental and human constraints forced the American politicians and the entrepreneurs to go abroad to keep growing. Even if the Americas stopped being very productive after 1850s, it didn't stop the processes which made the Western world richer after the discovery of the Americas. In particular, the Industrial Revolution made possible the conquest of the rest of the world by West Europeans and the conquest of Siberia by the Russians. That geographic expansion stopped only when the last available continent, Black Africa, had been divided among the colonial powers. For some years, Europe was able to expand economically by reorganizing its empires. But at the beginning of the 20th century, the competition over resources, the lack of farmland at home and abroad, and many other environmental constraints made further economic and demographic development increasingly difficult in Europe itself. Usually, problems like overpopulation, pollution, or terrorism are much more disagreeable for those who live nearby. This is the reason why such problems are normally solved near their sources, sometimes with an extreme violence. This is exactly what happens during the First World War, which made 37 million military casualties in Europe and possibly more among the civilian population. Unfortunately, such a large-scale massacre wasn't sufficient to solve the overpopulation problem of the continent. For the first time in 4 centuries, Europeans also realized that immigration could no longer be a solution, since most of the countries in the Americas had imposed limitations on the number of European immigrants they accepted. In USA, the first law limiting immigration passed in 1921. It would be followed by many others, always more restrictive. The economic depression of the 1930s would complicate things even more by transforming Europe in a powder keg which finally exploded in the most murderous war of all times. Historically speaking, the 2 world wars were in fact 2 episodes of the same war, but separated by a pause. Between 1914 and 1945, Europe simply released the surplus of energy it had accumulated since the discoveries of the Americas. It is so true that in 1951, just 6 years after the end of a war which killed between 40 and 50 million Europeans, mortal enemies like France and Germany decided to forget their age-old hatred of each other and to start the European Union. Due to the breakthrough made during the conflicts, Europe, despite the loss of its empires during the following 2 decades, became even richer than before. In retrospect, all that development was not that positive, because if scientists kept discovering new ways to extract wealth from the planet, they did it by poisoning its natural environments with fertilizers, pesticides, and millions of other chemical products. For some years after 1945, Europe remained the main provider of immigrants in North America, only to be replaced by Latin America, which was still producing 46% of all the immigrants entering in USA in 2013. If we take into account the fast and obvious economic decline of USA, we can predict that mass immigration will soon become a thing of the past in North America. Logically, it should happen during the coming economic depression. Whatever happens, one thing is certain. On a dying planet, the only solution to avoid the brutal and painful population collapse in North America will be to stop mass immigration and let the population decline as slowly as possible. If we don't do that, the continent could have the same fate as the former Russian Empire. Around 1900, Dmitri Mendeleev, the creator of the periodic table of elements, predicted that the population of the Russian Empire would reach 1 billion people in 2050. To make such a prediction, Mendeleev probably did what we did some minutes ago. He drew a straight line along the past population curve of Russia. Mendeleev couldn't foresee the massacres of the 2 world wars and of the Bolshevik Revolution. Today we know that Russia will be lucky if it has 130 million inhabitants in 2050, which will be a far cry from the billion people predicted by Mendeleev for the whole Russian Empire. Modern demographers are using exactly the same method to predict that Black Africa, for example, will have 4 billion inhabitants at the end of the 21st century. Such long-term predictions are ridiculous on a dying planet where 7 and soon 9 billion people want to live the American dream, where the ocean floor and the most remote Pacific island are already littered with garbage, and where China plans to build a megacity of 130 million people around Beijing. Nowadays, things go so fast that humans have already lost control of some of the most vital parts of the world economy. For instance, about 70% of all the transactions on Wall Street are made by high-speed computers, which are capable to manipulate, to execute millions of orders per second. And some of those computers can learn and change their behavior without any human supervision. This is even more frightening when we remember that the world financial markets have been gradually deregulated since Ronald Reagan. Nobody really controls them. By the way, I remind you that I normally put an internet bibliography at the end of my videos to allow viewers to verify what I say. As long as 90% of mankind was poor, we could hope to find solutions to our environmental problems. But today, the whole world is growing at an exponential rate without having the 10 new American continents we would need to feed its population. In the 70s, the Club of Rome used a clever metaphor to show that an exponential growth rate could not last in a limited environment. After describing a water lily which would fill a small pond in 30 days by doubling its size every day, they asked people when the water lily would have covered the first half of the pond. The answer to that question is obvious, but it's so strange that most people hesitate to give it. The correct answer is at the end of the 29th day, which means that the water lily would need 29 full days to cover the first half of the pond, but only 1 day to cover the second half. That simple anecdote shows that humans cannot adapt to the actual acceleration of history. We just can't comprehend that a phenomenon which has been growing at the same pace for centuries could destroy the planet in a matter of years. Humans didn't evolve much in the last 10,000 years. Basically, we are still hunter-gatherers like our prehistoric ancestors. Physically, the maximum speed a modern man can reach is 38 kilometers per hour. The most common car can go 3 times faster, and an airplane 30 times faster. Our senses are also not reliable at high speed. For example, most people believe that each small white line we see on a highway is 60 centimeters long, when in fact it is almost 3 meters long. Psychologically also, we are very slow. For instance, most people keep defending the ideas they picked up in the streets of their adolescence, even if you give them the absolute proof they are false. Worse, most people prefer a reassuring lie to a worrying truth. This is the defect fraudsters and politicians exploit to line their pockets with your money. This defect alone can be extremely dangerous in case of emergency, when people tend to panic and to do things which only worsen the situation. The best example being the panic selling during a stock market crash. All those human flaws explain why almost nothing is done to prepare the world for the coming crisis, even if everybody knows that a catastrophe is in the making. For decades, biologists have warned us about the thousands of species which are going extinct, and environmentalists kept talking against the overexploitation of the planet. For years, economists have complained about the unsustainable debt burdens of governments, companies, and individuals. Quite simply, people refuse to believe in what they know to be true. They are too afraid. They prefer to whistle in the dark. Very soon, we will run out of time. Imagine, the water lily is already filling the second half of the pond, and we didn't even begin to panic. As a consequence, things are going to get much worse before they get any better. We just can't destroy the only planet we have without paying a heavy price for it. Of course, we will not disappear. Our ancestors never did in the last 4 billion years. But only those clever enough to prepare themselves well in advance will thrive during the coming crisis. This will be the subject of my next video. I thank you in advance for subscribing to my channel, for giving a thumbs up, and for recommending this video to your friends. See you next time.